There is a woman named Dorothy who lived in a quiet suburb of Indianapolis in the early 1950s. She was a schoolteacher. She read the newspaper every morning, went to church on Sundays, and believed, with every fiber of her being, that she was a rational person. She was not the kind of person you would imagine getting swept up in anything. And yet, by 1953, Dorothy was reporting her next-door neighbor to the authorities. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because she had seen anything suspicious, but because someone she trusted had told her that the threat was everywhere, and that silence was the same as guilt. Dorothy's neighbor lost his job. His family lost their home. And Dorothy, years later, sitting in that same kitchen, would say something that has stayed with researchers ever since. She said, "I genuinely believed I was protecting my country. I had no idea I was inside something." That is the sentence this entire video is about. I had no idea I was inside something. Because here is what the history of human civilization reveals. When you look at it long enough, when you study the patterns beneath the propaganda and the politics and the religion and the movements, the same loop appears. Every single time. A loop so precise, so predictable, so devastatingly effective that it has claimed the minds of farmers and professors, of factory workers and senators, of devoted mothers and decorated generals. The faces change. The century changes. The language changes. But the architecture of the deception, the bones of it, never does. And that is what we are going to walk through today, step by step, using real history, documented psychology, and stories that will make you look at the world around you very differently by the time we are finished. Before we go any further, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what we are building here, week after week, is exactly this kind of content. The kind that does not let you look away. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of any one cult, or any one political movement, or any one mass deception. Let us begin at the beginning of the pattern itself, the moment historians and psychologists have identified as the entry point, the moment that makes everything else possible. And that moment, without exception, across every case in recorded history, starts not with a lie. It starts with something true. Think about that for a moment, because it matters more than almost anything else in this video. The loop does not begin with fiction. It does not begin with something a person would reject if they were paying attention. It begins with a wound. A real, documented, legitimate wound. Something that genuinely hurt people. Something that was genuinely unfair. And this is why intelligent people fall for it. This is the answer to the question that always gets asked. How could so many smart, educated, reasonable people have been pulled into something so destructive? The answer is because they were not pulled in by a lie. They were pulled in by a truth. And then, slowly, surgically, that truth was used against them. Let's talk about a man named Marcus. Marcus grew up in a small industrial town in the American Midwest in the 1920s. His father worked in a factory. His family was not wealthy, but they were stable. They had a house. They had enough food. They had a sense of dignity. And then the economy collapsed. Not slowly, overnight. The market crash of 1929 did not come with a warning. One day life made sense, and the next day it didn't. Marcus's father lost his job. Then the house. Marcus watched his family sleep in a relative's basement for 2 years. He watched his father, a proud man who had worked his whole adult life, stand in a bread line with his hat in his hand. That wound, that specific, documented, historical wound, was real. It was not manufactured, and Marcus carried it for the rest of his life. Now here is the question this video is really asking. What happens to a person who carries a wound like that and is then introduced to someone who seems to have the answer? This is where the second element enters the loop. Every mass movement in history, every cult, every political crusade, every episode of collective madness produces what researchers and historians have come to call the prophet figure. And this is not a religious term. It is a psychological one. The prophet is the figure who arrives at exactly the moment when the wound is freshest, when people are scared, when the institutions they trusted have failed them, when the old explanations no longer hold. The prophet arrives and does something remarkable, something that feels, in the moment, almost miraculous. The prophet names the wound, not vaguely, not with academic language, specifically and personally. They look at people like Marcus and they say, I see what happened to you. I understand why you are angry. Your anger is justified. And not only that, I know why it happened. And I know who is responsible. That last sentence is the key. That sentence is where the wound stops being just a wound and becomes a weapon. Because the moment you tell a person in pain not only that their pain is real, but that there is someone responsible for it, someone they can point to, you have done something to their brain that is almost impossible to undo. Psychologists call this cognitive closure. The mind, under stress, under fear, under the weight of unresolved suffering, craves an explanation above almost everything else. And the cleaner and simpler the explanation, the more satisfying it feels. This is not a character flaw. This is not a failure of intelligence. This is documented human neuroscience. We are wired to prefer a clear story over an unclear one, even when the clear story is wrong. Let us bring this to a specific case, because abstract ideas only carry you so far. In the mid-1950s, in Indianapolis, Indiana, a young minister named Solomon Reed began preaching in a racially integrated church, which, in that era, was nothing short of radical. He was white, and the majority of his congregation was black, and he preached a gospel of social justice, of equality, of the idea that the poor and the marginalized deserved better than what America had given them. And many of the things he said were true. Racial inequality in 1950s America was not a paranoid fantasy. It was documented daily in who got hired and who didn't, in who got served and who got turned away, in which neighborhoods had good schools and which ones didn't. The wound was real. Solomon Reed, who in reality was known to the world as the Reverend James Warren Jones, was speaking to people who had legitimate grievances, people who had been genuinely failed by the system. And that, researchers have noted, is precisely why what happened next was possible. Because over the following 2 decades, as Reed's congregation grew, something shifted. The message, which had begun with truth, began to be used for something else. The structure around the congregation became tighter. The rules became stricter. Members who asked questions found themselves publicly shamed. Those who tried to leave found their families pressured, their personal secrets, things they had confessed in private to their pastor, suddenly read aloud to the group as evidence of their disloyalty. And members were told, over and over, in sermons and in private meetings and in the middle of the night, that the world outside was dangerous, that the government was watching, that enemies were everywhere, that the only safe place, the only truly safe place, was inside the community. By 1977, when the congregation relocated to a jungle settlement in South America, a place they called a paradise, a promised land, a new society free from oppression, over 1,000 people followed. They built it with their own hands. Homes, kitchens, a medical clinic, fields for farming. And many of them, at least at first, believed with all their hearts that they had found something rare and real. Former members who survived have said, in interviews, that the early days genuinely felt like community, like belonging, like finally being seen. And that is the detail that matters most, because it is the detail that gets left out when we reduce these stories to cautionary tales about gullibility. These were not foolish people. These were people who wanted something real and were given a close enough imitation that they could not tell the difference until it was too late. What the psychological research tells us, and this is backed by decades of work by scholars who have studied high-control groups, is that by the time a person inside one of these movements begins to feel doubt, the doubt itself has been weaponized. The movement teaches them to interpret their own uncertainty as weakness, as faithlessness. as evidence that they are being influenced by the enemy. So the very moment when the rational mind sends up a flare, something is wrong here. The person has been trained to suppress it, not from stupidity, but from fear. Because by that stage, leaving means losing everything. Leaving means your family, your community, your identity, your understanding of how the world works. Psychologist Leon Festinger studied this phenomenon after following a small doomsday group in the 1950s, and what he found forms the cornerstone of what we now call cognitive dissonance theory. When reality contradicts a deeply held belief, the mind does not automatically update the belief. In fact, under certain conditions, particularly when the belief is tied to identity and community, the mind doubles down. It finds new explanations. It blames the doubter. It insulates itself further. On November 18, 1978, in that jungle settlement in Guyana, more than 900 people died. 304 of them were children. The official record describes it as a mass murder-suicide. A cyanide-laced drink was prepared and distributed. Some took it willingly. Many did not. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion. The children were administered the poison first, by nurses and parents who had been told this was an act of love, an act of defiance against an oppressive government. Their leader called it revolutionary suicide. And in the audio recordings made that day, recordings that still exist, that researchers have studied for decades, you can hear people crying. You can hear people asking questions. And you can hear a voice telling them, calmly, that this is the right thing to do. That history will remember them, that they are not defeated. 909 people died that day. It remains one of the largest single losses of American civilian life in a deliberate act prior to September 11, 2001. Now, if you are watching this and thinking, that could never happen to me, I want to gently, respectfully ask you to stay with this a little longer. Because the researchers who have spent careers studying these movements are unanimous on one point. The people most likely to say that could never happen to me are statistically no more resistant to the pattern than anyone else. In fact, there is a body of evidence suggesting that the certainty itself, the conviction that we are too smart, too rational, too independent to be swept up in something like this, is one of the conditions the pattern requires. Because certainty closes the mind, and a closed mind is precisely what these systems depend on. Let's go back further. Let us go to a different country, a different era, a different wound. The early 1950s in America, and a United States senator from Wisconsin named William Crane. William Crane was not the most powerful man in Washington. He was not particularly well regarded by his peers. He had, by most accounts, an unremarkable first term in office and was facing a difficult re-election. And then, in February of 1950, at a speaking event in Wheeling, West Virginia, he held up a piece of paper. And he told the crowd that he held in his hand a list of names. Confirmed members of the Communist Party working inside the United States State Department. Traitors, enemies, already inside the walls. He never showed the list to anyone. The number of names on it changed every time he mentioned it. Sometimes he said there were 205, sometimes 57, sometimes 81. The evidence for the specific accusations he made was, in almost every documented case, either fabricated, distorted, or non-existent. But none of that mattered in the moment, because the wound was real. The Soviet Union had just tested its first nuclear weapon. China had fallen to communism. The fear that something had gone wrong, that something had been lost, was genuine. And Crane had a name for the thing that had stolen it. What followed is documented in the congressional record, in the newspaper archives, in the personal testimonies of hundreds of men and women whose lives were destroyed. Professors lost their positions. Screenwriters and actors were blacklisted from working in their industry. Government employees were interrogated, not about specific actions, but about their beliefs, about books they had read, organizations they had belonged to 10 or 15 years earlier, people they had known in college. The accusation alone was enough. In many cases, The accused lost everything before a single piece of evidence was presented, because the social cost of being associated with the accusation was so high that employers, colleagues, and neighbors withdrew immediately. To be seen defending someone was to risk being accused yourself. And so most people didn't. Most people stayed silent and watched. Dorothy, the schoolteacher, watched, and she reported her neighbor, because by that point, silence had been redefined as disloyalty, and question asking had been redefined as complicity. This is the mechanism historians point to most often when they study how ordinary, decent people participate in mass deceptions. It is not that they become evil. It is that the rules of the game shift so gradually, and the cost of resistance rises so incrementally, that at no single moment does it feel like a choice between right and wrong. It feels, each time, like the only reasonable thing to do given the circumstances. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who spent decades studying how ordinary people participated in extraordinary atrocities, described this as the banality of evil, not a dramatic moral failure, but a slow, quiet series of small accommodations, each one individually justifiable, collectively catastrophic. Senator William Crane, who the world knew as Joseph McCarthy, was eventually brought down. Not by a dramatic revelation, not by a hero, by a single moment in a televised hearing in 1954, when a lawyer named Joseph Welch turned to him during a live broadcast and said, in a voice that the entire country heard, "Have you no sense of decency?" The room went quiet, and something shifted. The spell, which had held for 4 years, began to break. Not because the wound disappeared, not because the fear vanished, but because someone, in public, asked a question out loud. And that question, simple as it was, gave permission to the millions of people who had privately been thinking the same thing, but had not dared to say it. By the end of 1954, McCarthy's Senate colleagues formally censured him. He died 3 years later, largely discredited, still insisting that the enemies were real. Here is what the historical record shows. Across every case we have studied, from ancient Rome to the Crusades to the witch trials of Salem to the ideological purges of the 20th century to the digital misinformation ecosystems of right now, the loop always ends. It has never, in the full arc of documented history, lasted forever. But how it ends matters enormously, because the loop does not always collapse cleanly. Sometimes it collapses internally. The leader is exposed, the evidence dissolves, the members drift home carrying the wreckage. Sometimes it is dismantled by outside force. And sometimes, and this is the ending that researchers find most troubling, it mutates. It does not die, it rebrands. The prophet is replaced. The enemy is updated. The wound, which was never truly healed, is simply redirected. And the loop begins again, often with a new generation of people who have never heard of the last time. The Crusades did not begin because Europeans were cruel. They began because the papacy identified a wound, the loss of Holy Land, the threat to Christendom, and offered a solution wrapped in moral certainty and divine mandate. The men who marched did not march because they were stupid. They marched because they were told their suffering had meaning, and that the enemy of that meaning had a face. When the Crusades ended, having killed hundreds of thousands of people across multiple continents over 2 centuries, they did not end because the idea died. They ended because the resources ran out and the political will collapsed. But the psychological template remained, and it was used again and again. And it is being used right now, today, in every country in the world, in forms that are sometimes obvious and sometimes invisible, online, in political movements, in corporate cultures, in wellness communities, in churches, in comment sections. Because the loop does not require a jungle in Guyana or a Senate hearing room in Washington. It requires only 3 ingredients, in this precise order: a wound that is real, a voice that names it, and an enemy that explains it. Everything else follows from those 3 elements with the mechanical consistency of a natural law. The research of Dr. Robert Lifton, who spent decades studying thought reform and ideological control, identifies 8 specific conditions that high-control groups use to maintain power over their members, including control of information, the demand for purity, the dispensing of existence, meaning the belief that those inside the group are saved and those outside are lost. These conditions appear, with remarkable consistency, in political movements, religious organizations, and secular ideological communities alike. They do not require a charismatic madman. They can be implemented by a committee. They can emerge from an algorithm. And that is the part of this story that should make every person watching this sit with real discomfort for a moment. Because we live in an era in which the conditions for the loop have never been more efficiently manufactured. The wound has never been easier to identify. Data companies track your fears, your insecurities, your political anxieties, your health worries, and they sell that data to systems designed to serve you more of what makes you afraid. The prophet has never had a larger stage. A phone and an internet connection are enough to reach millions of people in the grip of their worst moment. And the enemy has never been easier to construct because the algorithm rewards outrage, and outrage requires a target. None of this means that every movement is a cult. None of this means that every leader is a manipulator. None of this means that every wound is manufactured. The wound, in all of these cases, is real. That is the point. The grievance that drives people toward these loops is almost always rooted in something genuine. Economic failure is real. Racial injustice is real. Political corruption is real. The fear that the world your children will inherit is worse than the one you were given. That is a real and legitimate fear felt by millions of men across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom right now. What the loop does is take that legitimate fear and redirect it. It gives it a shape that serves someone else's purpose. It takes the energy of genuine suffering and converts it into loyalty, into compliance, into silence. The men and women who survived these movements, the ones who got out of Jonestown before November 18th, the ones who quietly stopped showing up to the McCarthy-era meetings, the ones who eventually walked away from whatever version of the loop they had been inside. Almost all of them described the moment of clarity the same way. It was not a single dramatic revelation. It was a quiet question that would not go away. A moment where something they were told did not quite match something they had seen with their own eyes. A small inconsistency, a crack in the story, and instead of suppressing it, as they had been trained to do, they let themselves follow it. And that thread, pulled gently, eventually unraveled everything. The historian Thucydides, writing about the collapse of Athenian democracy in the 5th century before the Common Era, described a society that had been convinced to vote away its own protections in the name of security. Citizens who had surrendered their judgment to men who promised clarity in a time of chaos. He described the moment the city turned on itself as a kind of collective madness, not the madness of individuals who had lost their minds, but the madness of a community that had stopped asking questions. He wrote about it as a warning, and 2,500 years later, the warning has not expired. So what do you do with this? What does a person do, sitting with this information, knowing that the loop exists, knowing that it is running right now in a dozen different forms, knowing that intelligent and decent people have been caught inside it in every century of recorded human history? The answer, based on everything the research shows, is not cynicism. Cynicism is just the loop in reverse. It replaces blind belief with blanket rejection, and both of them close the mind. The answer is something harder and less satisfying than a single solution. The answer is the habit of the question, the willingness, even when it is socially costly, to ask out loud, does this actually make sense? Is the evidence for this as strong as I have been told? Who benefits from me believing this? What am I not being allowed to see? These are not comfortable questions. They are not the questions that win you friends inside a closed community. They are not the questions that get rewarded by the algorithm or applauded at the rally or celebrated by the group. But they are the questions that every single person who ever broke free from one of these loops describes as the turning point. The small, quiet, ordinary act of asking out loud, "Does this actually make sense?" Dorothy, the schoolteacher from Indianapolis, eventually stopped. Years after her neighbor had lost his job and his home, years after the Senate had censured Crane, McCarthy, years after the whole machinery had been exposed for what it was, Dorothy sat in her kitchen and she asked the question she had been too afraid to ask before. And the asking of it, even that late, even after all the damage had been done, changed something in her. She said it felt like a window opening in a room she had forgotten was sealed. You are watching this because some part of you already knows how to ask that question. You have lived long enough, seen enough, been through enough to know what it feels like when something is not quite right. Guard that instinct. It is more valuable than almost anything else you carry. Because the loop is patient. It does not need to catch you at your worst. It just needs to catch you at your most afraid. And the only thing that has ever reliably interrupted it, in any century, in any country, in any language, is a person who, at the moment when the group demands silence, chooses instead to speak. What is the version of this loop you have seen in your own life? Not historically, personally, in a workplace, in a community, in a belief system you once held and eventually walked away from. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this kind of thinking is what you come here for, you already know what to do. Next week, we are going into one specific modern case, something that millions of people in this audience live through in real time, and most of them still do not fully understand what it was. You will want to be here for that.